Hello, I'm Alan Rule from alanrule.com, and with me I got pro-life activist Cam Wilson. He has joined me before to talk about pro-life issues, as he's a full-time pro-life activist. But now uh, what a lot of people don't know is that his hobby and his education is actually in, of all things, military history. I got a story once, back when Cam and I lived in the same city. I asked him a question about the Battle of Stalingrad, and it turned into a 2-hour explanation, and I was like on the edge of my seat while he was telling me about Stalingrad and Field Marshal von Manstein and his tactical retreat, and it was just amazing. And yeah, he joins me today. We are going to talk about the Crusades. The Crusades, a very interesting topic, very misunderstood, and yeah, Cam Wilson, how are you?
Good, good. Thanks for having me, Alan.
All right. Uh, just just a big general question. What are the Crusades? Just take a minute and give an overall summation.
So the Crusades, you can take a very broad view of the Crusades or a very narrow view of the Crusades. The narrow view is the traditional perspective that the Crusades start with a famous speech from the Pope calling on Catholics and Western Christians at the time to march and retake the Holy Land from the Muslims who are attacking the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium as it was called then, and were persecuting Christians actively throughout the East. And the idea was that you'd create a large army of devoted Christians who would march out and do something good for God to protect Christians who are under attack in other places. And those crusades are typically, 1090s until I believe 1291 is the fall of Acre, or Acre, which in the Holy Land, which ends the presence of the Christian Crusader states in the Holy Land. And the Crusades obviously continue on after that in the sense that crusading orders continue the fight to hold back the expansion of, at first, the Mameluke expansion and then the Ottoman Turk expansion. And they're at the forefront of a lot of major wars. The Knights of St. John hold out on two different sieges of Rhodes, and only on the third siege does it fall, and that's extremely significant in slowing down the rate of expansion of the empire. There are two sieges of Malta, both of which fail, and that again slows it down. And these knightly orders even participate in the Battle of Lepanto. I mean, they're just ready for the fight whenever there was a fight to be had to hold back the expansionism of the Ottoman Turks in particular. So it continues on for quite a while until the Napoleon eventually is the one who ends the Knights of Malta by conquering Malta, but traditionally it's considered to be about the 1090s to about 1291.
So, yeah, and guys, just for the record, Cam here knows the entire poem Lepanto by heart. I've seen him recite it. It's impressive. Not the whole one?
No, just the first couple of stanzas.
Oh, you know more than that, I think. Like you were going on for a couple minutes there. I remember that one time at that party. You're just okay. Now let's back up. You talked about the Pope giving the speech. That's the Council of Clermont in 1095, 1096, and but a couple decades before that, talk about what happened. With the Turks in 1071, Manzikert, etc.
Yeah, so the background to this is you have the Byzantine Empire, which, if you have some historical knowledge, you know that the Byzantine Empire has a tendency to expand and contract and expand and contract, and it does this several different periods of time. And in fact, right when it falls, it seemed poised for another moment of expansion. It had a great emperor who was slowly gaining territory back, who was doing all the little right things to get it done, but ultimately it faced an overwhelming force that it couldn't possibly defeat. But there's this history of expansion and contraction. And in 1071, the Byzantine Empire is at the high point of its new contraction. its expansion.
Yeah.
Of a new period of expansion, and at the Byzantine emperor, who at this point in time had successfully conducted several military campaigns, was poised, had to have a legacy of one of the great military commanders of the age, to be a name like Napoleon or other great commanders, and he arrogantly marches his army. He gets overconfident and he marches his army into central Anatolia or central Turkey, and gets ambushed by the Turks, by the Seljuk Turks, at a place called Manzikert, and his army gets destroyed. And the result is, at that point, you have a rapid contraction again of the empire, and the Byzantine Empire, which at this point in time had most of Turkey under its control, loses essentially all of Turkey. That was in 1071. Now in 1095, and at that point in time, the Seljuk Turks are again starting to get restless and energized, looking for more conquests. So the Byzantine emperor sends a message to the Pope asking for relief, asking for Western Christians to come to their aid. There's a lot of debate amongst historians about what he asked for exactly. A lot of historians
is a letter not exist?
Well, the letter does exist, I believe. I believe it's probably in the papal records. But he asks for a force. He doesn't ask for a size. He doesn't give a number to it. Right? And so there's lots of historians who thought that he was just asking for more soldiers. One of the most famous units of the Byzantine army is a group called the Varangian Guard, who are essentially Vikings, Saxons at this point in time, because if you note the history here, 1066 is when the Battle of Hastings occurs.
Yeah, the
Man's occurred. Hastings takes place, and the Normans conquer England. And so you've got all of these Saxon warriors who die or get displaced as a result of this. So a lot of them end up going to Byzantium, joining the Varangian Guard. You've got Vikings joining the Varangian Guard, Normans, and you just have Frankish knights ultimately joining the Varangian Guard. And this is a group of elite warriors, and for already they are known as the best warriors in the world for hand-to-hand combat. And so some historians think he just was asking for another group of them to come out west. But regardless, what he gets is a very large Western army of Crusaders who come over and ultimately do a lot of disruption to his empire as they move through, but which also, had he been wiser in his way of coordinating with them, would have resulted in much greater, much more permanent gains for the Byzantine Empire.
So now, before the Turks come on the scene, the Holy Land is controlled by a group out of Egypt called the Fatimids. Just talk a bit about the Fatimids.
So the Fatimids are, I believe they were Sunni?
No, Shia.
They were Shia. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're the Fatimids ultimately are this large empire or large grouping of peoples in Egypt, basically, and it's a dynasty that rules Egypt and much of the Middle East for a period of several hundred years. Until they get starting to be beaten back by the Seljuk Turks, who are expanding out of central Anatolia. And it's important to remember that Turk is the Turkoman peoples. So actually they're from Central Asia and have been pushing west for quite a while. About half of the army of Genghis Khan were Turkomans, actually. Would have been the exact same ethnic group of people who are in his army from all the way over in Mongolia. And so this is that same group of people who are fierce warriors, excellent horsemen, excellent horse archers, which is a very, very difficult thing to become accustomed to doing. You essentially have to be raised in the saddle, firing a bow from the saddle to be able to do it. You can't just train it up later in life. And because they were accustomed to life in the saddle as nomads, they become a very, very fierce group of warriors and a very, very effective military force. And
So,
they start to settle battles and take Jerusalem in the mid, I believe it's the mid 10th century or 11th century.
yeah, and well, they take, as far as I know, they had taken much of the Middle East, and Jerusalem kept going back and forth between the Fatimids and the Turks. But by the time that the Crusaders come to Constantinople to Antioch, the Turks control Antioch, and tell us a bit about Antioch.
So, Antioch is the jewel of the East at this point in time, of the Near East, of the Middle East. Sorry, this is the richest city. It's the city at the center of many of the Eastern trade routes. It's probably the largest port, I believe, in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a central, wealthy city, and of course, recapturing it is essential if you want to have good supply lines to a march on Jerusalem. Because if you look at a map, you have Anatolia, which is a little bulge, and then you have the kind of almost at a right angle, it comes down towards Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, kind of straight down from there. And Antioch is right almost at the exact corner of that right angle. And so if you want to get to Jerusalem from Constantinople, if you want to have a sure line of supply back to Constantinople, you either have to have Antioch in a state of virtual siege constantly, or capture it. Otherwise, there will always be a force that can just move out and disrupt your supply lines and your lines of communication. So Antioch is this very, very important city in the Crusades. And the Crusaders, they leave Constantinople, marching in the First Crusade, and they first of all march on Nicaea and capture it before the Turks are even really prepared for them. And the Turks have a lot of contempt for Western soldiers. They don't see them as great horsemen. They're not great archers. So from the perspective of a Eastern horse archer, where the pinnacle of soldierliness is your ability to ride a horse and your ability to fire a bow, these seem like plodding, useless farmers who you're just going to destroy easily in a battle, and it won't even matter much that they're in large numbers. And this overconfidence results in a series of battles around, the biggest one being around Dorylaeum. So during this Battle of Dorylaeum, you have an advance guard of Christians, a vanguard of the Christian Crusaders in the march between Nicaea and Antioch, who get ambushed by Turkish horse archers. And these are overconfident soldiers. They believe that they're easily going to rout these peasant farmers from the west, these illiterate, listed off. And the vanguard holds fast because of Bohemond, this great almost not proto, but post-Viking warrior who still has all the ethos of Viking war-making, whilst titularly, at least, being a Christian and a knight. And he keeps the vanguard in place. The rest of the army moves up. He swings around the side and charges in. And ultimately, the Crusaders scatter the forces of the Turks, and they decisively defeat them to such an extent that they don't ever try to bother the Crusaders again in their retreat and in their advance. Sorry. And so the Crusaders win the Battle of Dorylaeum, and then move down to attack Antioch, and they besiege Antioch, and it becomes a whole ordeal. And many people consider this to be the lowest point of the Crusade, because the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor, decides to stop supporting them because he thinks it's now hopeless, that they have no chance of taking Antioch. The crusading army itself starts to doubt whether they can take Antioch. This is a very large city. Capturing a city in siegecraft is very, very, very difficult. And this is before gunpowder. This is before you have effective siege equipment. And so it's very difficult to do. It's a very tough task. And starving an opponent to death only works when you have more weeks or months' supply of food for your army than they have for their army inside the city. And it's a near-run thing, who has more food at this point in time. And in fact, Stephen of Blois runs away from the crusade at this point in time. And he runs all the way back to Europe, and he gets back to Europe in time to hear that Jerusalem has fallen to the Crusaders. And so it really doesn't work out well for him.
Well, apparently Stephen of Blois, like you talked about how the Byzantine Emperor eventually withdrew support. That's because I think Stephen of Blois was on the way back, and he told him it was hopeless, right?
Yeah. He just gives up and gets branded. In fact, he has to. I believe later in life he returns to the Holy Land as a Crusader because his wife just.
Yeah, his wife was
being a coward. I get,
Yeah.
Handing the shield like a Spartan woman, saying "Return with it or on it."
Ooh.
But they actually take Antioch, and they take Antioch in large part because Crusaders are better at siegecraft, at both besieging and withstanding siege than their Muslim opponents for reasons of military technology and military style. They take Antioch, and then in the last-ditch effort, they march out down to Jerusalem and capture Jerusalem, which has just been retaken from the Seljuks by the Fatimids as a result of the siege of Antioch and the withdrawal of the Seljuk Turks after the defeat of Dorilan. And in a last-ditch effort on Jerusalem, because they know they don't have the resources to be able to besiege it, they have to storm it. They successfully storm Jerusalem, which again is an incredible, miraculous event, and establish the Crusader Kingdom, which is then defended successfully at the Battle of Ascalon. And at this point in time, it's generally considered the First Crusade is over. Many Crusaders return back to Europe, and the Crusader state that is referred to as Outremer is set up as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. You have the County of Tripoli, you have the Principality of Antioch, which Bohemond sets up. He refuses to march on Jerusalem. He says, I've got Antioch, I've got my state. So he sets up the Principality of Antioch. And another group of Crusaders move out to Edessa and set up the County of Edessa. Those are the 4 Crusader states that are set up from the First Crusade. And from this point onwards, the Crusader states are actually slowly whittled down until, in 1291, their last significant enclave is Acre, which is a port city, which falls.
So, the fall of Acre or however is 1291. Let's rewind it a bit. Who is Saladin?
So Saladin is a wily political operator. It's the best way of understanding Saladin. He wasn't a great military commander. In fact, he fails far more often than he is successful in combat. And it should be remembered that before the Third Crusade even starts, you have Baldwin the Leopard King of Jerusalem, who successfully defeats Saladin on several occasions, with Saladin's entire battle army gets destroyed on several occasions, sometimes quite heroic.
This is just time frame. This is in the 1170s.
Yes, this is right before the Second Crusade. The Third Crusade. So the Second Crusade is the 1130s or so.
Yeah.
So what happens in this time period is the First Crusade is successful for a handful of reasons, right? The biggest one being the Turks were surprised and outfought at Dorilan, which allowed the Crusaders to march through Turkey and come down into Jerusalem, something that never happens again in Crusading history. Armies attempt it, but they are always defeated by the Turks. So that's the first one. So you have the Turkish resistance was less effective than it is in later Crusades. Secondly, the East is completely unprepared for the Western style of war, which is
the Frankish charge, right?
The Frankish charge, yeah. It's close combat. It's heavy cavalry primarily, running down everything else. So that, as I said before, the Eastern way of war is horse archers, which is a system of warfare that works very well if you can stay away from your opponent, pepper them with arrows until they're so weak they can't resist you, and then you charge in with the sword to finish them off. But if you're fighting an opponent whose entire way of war is close combat, whose warrior mentality isn't to be the most proficient archer, the most effective horseman possible, but rather get me within sword length of my opponent and I will crush him. And that is their psychology, their warrior psychology. If an opponent like that is equipped entirely for close combat warfare, so you've got heavy armor. At this point in time, it would have been good stout chainmail. And you have soldiers who are mounted on horses that are taller than their opponents on average. So they're more of a plow horse than an Arabian steed, which is a smaller but faster horse. And you have the psychology. So you have the weapons, the psychology advantage over your opponent. If in that circumstance, between those two weapons, styles of war, if the European knights are able to make contact and get into close contact with the Eastern soldiers, it's not even a contest. And in fact, the history of the Crusades can be summed up in a single concept, that when the Western Crusaders are able to get to close quarters with their opponents, they win the battle, almost despite the odds. And when the Eastern Muslim forces are able to keep their opponents at a distance, to harass, to harry, to fight the battle of horse archers, they tend to exhaust the Christian armies and defeat them. So it's who's ever able to impose their style of warfare better. And you'll note that the hand-to-hand combat is what's key in sieges. Sieges are not won by mobility. You're stuck in one spot. You have to go to your opponent.
So tell us then. This is actually a good segue. So tell us how all of this fits into the famous Battle of Hattin.
Actually, yes. So the famous Battle of Hattin. So Saladin essentially waits out the death of the Leper King because he knows he can't beat him in combat. His opponent is just too wily a general to be able to be defeated in combat, and then attacks the kingdom at a particularly weak moment. So the new king, King Guy, is not considered legitimate by the Crusader barons. They don't really think of him as having a lot of legitimacy. And there's an ethos in the Crusaders of get me to grips with my opponent, and I will beat them. And a Crusader general who isn't able to convince his soldiers that the best strategy is sometimes to hold back is almost always a failed Crusader general. You have Bohemond in the First Crusade who's able to hold his men back because they trust him as a warrior. They know he's not a coward. They know he's a good soldier. They know he's personally brave. So they allow him to corral them into some sort of order, which allows them to only fight when they can get to close combat with their opponents. You see the same thing with Richard during the Third Crusade. Richard is able to convince his knights that he's a good enough knight, that he's not a coward, he's not holding back for lack of martial vigor. And so he's able to corral his knights such that the major battles during the Third Crusade, the Crusaders win them all because they're able to close with their opponent and drive them back. But at the Horns of Hattin, you have a general, you have the commander of the crusading kingdoms who is not ready for it. He's not considered a great knight. He's not considered a great leader. And so when...
just pause for a second. Are you talking about Guy or Reynald?
Guy.
Okay.
So Reynald is part of Guy's army.
Okay.
So he's one of the barons, the Crusader barons. And so Guy is in a situation where he knows if he attacks Saladin at the Horns of Hattin, he's going to have to march through the desert to get there. There's only one source of water, which is controlled by his opponents. and his opponents are going to be able to dictate the terms of warfare on him. But he also knows that if he doesn't advance, he won't be king.
Oh, his eyes were bigger than his stomach, so I guess, and
yeah, there's a famous letter that he was written by, I believe it was the commander of the Knights of St. John, which said, if you march out and attack Saladin, you will be defeated. But if you stay here, the shame and reproach is going to be great.
Oh, so he was between a rock and a hard place.
He's in this very difficult spot. So he marches out, and he has to fight the battle on his opponent's terms. He gets defeated. But because these knights are larger, slower horses, the infantry are infantry, and his opponent has a huge contingent of horse archers who are light, mobile cavalry. When he loses the battle, he loses everything. Virtually every single crusading knight is captured in the battle, and all of the sergeants, what are called the sergeants, which are soldiers of lower rank than knight, are captured and executed. So the great mass of the army is actually executed. And because there's not a large flow of immigration from the New World to the Old, there's no real mass of Crusader armies that stays in Palestine from this point onwards. The mass of Crusaders are gone. You have the knights who managed to ransom themselves back, but you've temporarily lost all armed forces. So Saladin's able to just sweep in and capture virtually the entire Holy Land. The entire kingdom of Outram or the kingdom of Jerusalem. And
wait. Just pause for a second. Before we I just want to ask this: what is the relationship between Guy and Reynald of Chatillon? Do they have a good relationship or bad?
So their relationship is they're both, I believe, they are both newcomers to the Holy Land. Right? Neither of them were born there.
Yeah.
And you can actually tell typically because Reynald de Chatillon, just to give some background, he provokes Saladin on several occasions, including what we would consider today to be a pretty egregious war crime, where he takes a raiding party on boat around to intercept, acts of piracy essentially, to intercept pilgrims going to Mecca during the Hajj. And then he massacres them. So he commits an act of piracy, he massacres them, and then leaves. And this provokes a war until King Baldwin, the leper king, who is still alive, marches out, meets Saladin. Saladin realizes he doesn't really want to test this versus Baldwin. But Baldwin lets Reynald de Chatillon have it. He just lets him have it. And punishes him pretty severely. I believe he even makes him kiss his leprous hand.
Yeah, they show that in Kingdom of Heaven, if you remember that movie.
Yeah, a terrible movie.
Yeah, terrible movie.
What I like about it is that they do portray King Baldwin as being a great, noble sovereign.
Now, I've got a quote from historian Thomas Madden. I want to see if you can tell who he's talking about. Quote, "Perhaps the best military mind of the Middle Ages," close quote.
Perhaps the best military mind of the Middle Ages.
Yes. Who's Thomas Madden talking about?
Ooh. Is that Richard?
Richard the Lionheart. That's who we're going to talk about next. So, as soon as Saladin takes back Jerusalem and things look like they're on the down low, then the Third Crusade happens. Now Thomas Madden has said the Third Crusade is the Super Bowl of Crusades because it's got all the big names. You know, it's got Saladin, King Richard the Lionheart, King Philip II of France. So yeah, just talk about the Third Crusade a bit.
It's also got Frederick the Great.
Frederick the Great, even more, you know.
So the Third Crusade is this this great kingly crusade. So they often refer to the First Crusade as the Prince Crusade, because no kings take part in the First Crusade. The Second Crusade, you have the King of France joining, but he's pretty incompetent when it comes to fighting wars, and he marches out into the middle of Syria and then marches back, and it's a big fiasco because he doesn't accomplish anything in his entire crusade. But the Third Crusade, you have King Philip II, who's a very competent king. You have Richard the Lionheart, and you have Frederick the Great of the Holy Roman Empire, all declare that they're joining the crusade. And so you have essentially the combined might of the greatest kings of Christendom marching out on this crusade. So it seems like this is finally the time when we have the united front that we've always wanted. This will be even more powerful than the First Crusade. But that undermines a lot of what made the First Crusade so successful. Because the great weakness of the First Crusade is that it was command by committee. You had 6 different princes who all kind of had to make decisions on what was going forward, and they all commanded their own little portion of men, and so you had lots of problems that came from that. But ultimately, everyone worked together for one end, and there was a lot less national rivalry. There was the common end of getting to Jerusalem and conquering it, and they had disagreements about how to do that best and about how to stroke one general's ego or another. But it was basically that goal. Whereas in the Third Crusade, you have these 3 great kings, 2 of which make it to the Holy Land. And it's more about national rivalry when they're there. And there's a good argument can be made that Philip has only come along on the crusade to keep an eye on Richard, who's betrothed to Philip's, I think it's his daughter or his sister.
Yeah, I don't know all the details behind that. Like, I'm just currently reading up on that, and are you talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine?
No, I believe Eleanor of Aquitaine was.
Is that the mother of Richard?
Yeah, it's the mother.
Yeah, I can't remember all this because I know she was married to someone and she got an annulment, right? Then she married another king. I can't remember who offhand, though.
Yes.
I don't know. I might be getting mixed up here. So the point is, you have these 2 kings because Frederick drowns on the way there.
Yeah,
and
crossing a river.
Crossing a river. That's of all ways to die, you know. And so you have King Richard, and how is King Richard able to fare against Saladin's army?
So the first step of the crusade is capturing a port, because essentially the entire Holy Land has been captured. And so you have the siege of Acre again. This is the first major siege of Acre, which the Crusaders taking it back from Saladin's forces. And so you have the English and the French combined to besiege the city, and ultimately they take it. But at this point in time, the French leave. So the French leave because they fed up. King Philip knows that he's not the soldier that King Richard is, and doesn't want to be seen as less than King Richard. So he takes the success of Acre and says, "We're gone." So he leaves with his army, or most of his army, and what stays behind is under the united command now of Richard. And Richard has a very difficult choice to make, because the goal of the crusade is to capture Jerusalem. But if you just capture Jerusalem, it's not very defensible.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to cut Jerusalem off from the sea unless you create an entire framework of states and castles around that to make it a state that can actually function. And so but Richard knows that he only has a season or 2 of crusading that he can possibly do before his army returns. So he wants to do as much as he can and put as much threat to Jerusalem as he can in this time. So that's his difficulty. Is that he knows he needs to take Jerusalem, but he also knows that if he takes Jerusalem, he's not going to be able to defend it. So
Now, apparently,
Stalemate, Third Crusade.
well, apparently at this point, just correct me if I'm wrong here. He considered, he says, part of the support of Saladin's in Egypt. So he wanted them to take portions of Egypt to cut off the supplies to the Holy Land, so it kind of starve them out. But his army was like, no, this is a holy pilgrimage. Jerusalem is holy and Egypt isn't.
Mm-hmm. So this is the very beginning of the strategy of Egypt, and the idea is actually much more realpolitik than that. It's that he knows that Egypt is worth more to the Fatimids than Jerusalem.
The Fatimids, you mean the Ayyubids, right?
The Ayyubids, because the Ayyubids are essentially taken out in a coup by Saladin. So Saladin's united all the Muslim forces basically in the area under his control, temporarily. It doesn't last long.
Yeah, as soon as he dies, it falls apart pretty much, right?
Pretty much. So he unites all of this vast coalition. So he has huge resources to draw on. So unlike the First Crusade, you're facing a larger, more formidable, and more organized opponent that knows the strength of the Western Knights is close combat fighting, and so he wants to deny them in so much as he possibly can decisive victories in close combat. And so that's Saladin's strategy, is just don't fight them in the major battle. Every time he does, he loses.
So I suppose it's kind of like what the Romans did with Hannibal, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, just do everything but engage them hand to hand.
Exactly, and then he knows that it's really tough to besiege a city like Jerusalem while having an army operating on your flanks that can cut off your supplies at any moment, right? Mm-hmm. And so long as his army isn't scattered, Jerusalem can't fall. And that's the basic strategy he pursues, is just don't get bogged down in close combat warfare with the knights. And so those two pieces of information are critical to how the Second Crusade breaks down. So what Richard does, and it's very, very smart, is he marches down the coast in order to get them the closest path between himself and Jerusalem. Because he can resupply by ship. They have complete control of the sea. And so he marches down the coast. And he takes all the port cities. And this actually is a strategic foundation which lasts for another 120 years or so. These ports that Richard captures and give a strategic position to the Crusader states they otherwise didn't have. And he wants to mount a new crusade into Egypt, because he knows if he can capture Cairo and Alexandria, he can trade those for Jerusalem, or he can hold them as a future state from which to march out and capture Jerusalem and give strategic depth. Either way, it's better to build the strategic position before capturing Jerusalem than to just march on Jerusalem. Okay. And that was his idea, but he's not able to accomplish this. He arranges a truce ultimately that ends the Third Crusade. He goes back to Europe, intending to come back with a new crusading army to finish off his plan, but he dies before he's able to.
Yeah, and in fact, in the 2010 Robin Hood movie, have you seen that movie?
I believe, yeah.
Yeah,
is that
the one with Cate Blanchett and Russell Crowe. Yeah. They show him. He gets shot by an arrow. So he dies back in France, and so let's fast forward here. It's not Saladin who dealt the final blow to the Crusaders. At the time Saladin died, there were still several Crusader states left. Who is the one, or who are some of the people that managed to finish off the Crusader states?
So I'm trying to remember the name of the Mamluk Baibars.
Yeah, Baibars. Yeah.
So Baibars is a absolutely ruthless individual. The kind of guy who would not blink at genocide if it accomplished his personal ambitions.
Would it be
at genocide when it accomplishes his ambitions?
That's
exactly his program.
Well, that's what he did to Antioch. He literally killed everyone in the city.
That's what he did to every state he captures. He kills or enslaves every single person.
He sounds like Tamerlane almost.
Yeah. He kills all the men and puts all the women into sexual slavery. That is his program. And his tactical aim for it is he knows that the Crusader states are not going to get reinforced in terms of new settler population from the west. So if he eliminates all the possible settler population, the problem's done. And at this point in time, he puts together a very, very effective military force. And he's faced with two problems, right? The one, he wants to finally end the two ambitions of his reign are to defeat the looming Mongol threat in the east and to finally destroy the Christians, to finally end all presence of Christian Crusader states in the Middle East. And he does both of those things. And he does it by creating a military state where everything is devoted to the training of his Mamluk corps of men who are slave soldiers. And they're very good horse archers. They're mostly recruited. They're stolen as kids or purchased as kids as slaves from Turkey. So they're Turkish horse archers from boyhood, and they're slaves, and they only gain their freedom upon entering the military. And it's a brutally effective military force that's able to defeat the Mongols, although it must be noted that they only defeated the Mongols when they had a huge numerical superiority over the Mongols and at the end of the Mongol supply line. But he essentially has, compared to the Crusaders at this point in time, after the Horns of Hattin, after the elimination of almost all commoner Crusaders, he has an immense numerical advantage over his opponents. And he uses that advantage to systematically capture every stronghold. He puts Acre under siege and essentially just wins by overwhelming the defenses with numbers that even the Christians can't withstand.
Are you talking about Acre, or are you talking about Antioch?
Both fall in the same
cycle.
Same 2 years, same cycle of combat.
Yeah.
Well, this campaign is mounted against them essentially simultaneously.
Well, because I know Baibars, he takes Antioch in the 1260s. I can't remember the exact year, and then there's another Crusader state that falls in 1277, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
County of Tripoli.
Yeah, the county of Tripoli, and then all you have is Acre, but like I don't think Baibars. I think he died. His son continued it, right?
Son finishes it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and he and that in 1291 Acre falls, and that's the end of the main. Like there still are crusades after that, but they're much more modest affairs, like holy leagues and.
Well, the crusades after this are different in type. So they have, and in a way, they're more efficient and effective. So crusade will be made for a specific objective, right? To, for example, Vienna, to prevent Vienna falling to the Turks, or to Lepanto was a crusade of types, and it was to prevent the Turkish fleet from gaining dominance of the Mediterranean. There was a crusade to relieve the Knights of Malta when Malta was under siege.
Well, the Knights of Malta, or is it the Knights Hospitality? I was listening to Thomas Madden's 8-hour lecture on the cruise. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. that the around 1300, King Philip IV of France suppresses the Templars, and that sends a wave throughout Europe. And then slowly each country starts suppressing Templars. Now that I think of it, it's pretty similar to what happened to the Jesuits, but that's another story. But then the Knights Hospitalier were kind of like, oh, we may be next, so we better make ourselves useful. So they capture some islands in the Mediterranean, or
so the Knights Hospitaller were more genuinely just more convinced of the need to stay in the fight. The Templars were confused because once Acre fell, or Acre fell, they had no foothold in the Holy Land, and they were focused on Jerusalem. Like, that was their aim. And the fall of Acre made it almost impossible for them to ever get there, absent a major state giving them aid, which wasn't likely in the foreseeable future. So they kind of returned mumbling to their monasteries in Europe and grumbling. They had no more purpose. Whereas the Knights Hospitaller more or less took the mindset of, we're just going to be in the fight until the fight's done. And so they're like, okay, that fell. Acre fell. We're going to Rhodes, which is an island off the Turkish coast. And they became a thorn in the side of the Turks for the next almost it's got to be 200 years, 300 years.
So
off the coast of.
This at this time, it's not the Seljuks. Is it Ottomans at this time, or is it the Sultanate of Rum?
So Turkey becomes very confused after the First Crusade. Because during the First Crusade, one of the reasons why the Turks were not able to offer great resistance was that there was infighting in the royal family of the Seljuk Turks. And so they were not, like, there was rival claims to the throne or to the leadership that never get resolved. So just, over time, the Seljuks become more and more and more and more fractured. And the Mongols, I think it's actually the Timurids, Timur the Lame, who comes in and just wipes them out. And from the ashes of that come the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, which are a distinct group of Turkic peoples who established their empire. So during this period, it's really hard to draw. You can't draw lines on a map to say who owns what. In fact, you don't end up drawing lines on a map anywhere in the world until the 1648. I think it's Westphalia. The Westphalian system starts drawing lines on a map. Before that, it was just like, this person's able to say they control these villages and these people. That's kind of how it worked.
So when was, like, the Battle of Lepanto was considered a crusade. Pope Pius V declared it a crusade, gave the relevant plenary indulgence. He blessed the ships as they left the port. But what about what was that the last crusade, or was there one after that with Jan Sobieski?
I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you on that side of things. What I do know is that throughout this period, there's the specific moments where you call a crusade is called for a specific action and a specific threat. But there's also crusading going on constantly. You have the Knights of Santiago, and in Spain, the slow Reconquista, which is done partially with crusaders, partially with just feudal battles, and it's all mixed up whether or not it's crusading. And so there's a lot of ambiguity of when somebody's crusading and when somebody's not crusading in Iberia, but it's generally considered to be a crusading struggle, a crusading front. And then you have the Knights of St. John, who hold Rhodes until after the fall of Constantinople, and then the Ottoman Empire throws wave after wave at Rhodes, and finally on the third siege of Rhodes capture it. And that's actually two massive armies that did not plunge headlong into Europe. They're broken on the wave of on Rhodes, which has significant For example, I think that Hungary would have fallen much sooner. I think that Vienna probably would not have been the high watermark of the Ottomans. It would have been further had Rhodes not been there. But then finally on the third siege of Rhodes, the Crusaders are forced to capitulate. They move then to Malta and keep up the fight from Malta. And all of this is considered, this is a crusading order. The Knights Hospitaller, and when they move to Malta, they end up being referred to as the Knights of Malta. And this crusading order continues the fight. And so they're crusading the whole time, not on a specific crusade, they're just a crusader front.
And then in the late 1300s, the 1390s, and the 1440s, you have two failed crusades called the Crusade of Nicopolis and the Crusade of Varna. Just talk a bit about those.
I don't actually know a lot about those two crusades, sorry.
Well, apparently the Crusade of Nicopolis, I'll say this much, it was in the 390s. It was to save the Byzantine Empire. Apparently that was the largest crusader army ever put together, and it was just smashed. Same with Varna. I don't think Varna was as big, but it was equally unsuccessful at pushing back the Turks. It's a bit ironic when you think about it. Most of the Crusades were to do with the Turks. You know, it's not called until they invade the Middle East. And like the later Crusades, Nicopolis, Varna, Lepanto, and even Vienna with Jan Sobieski. I don't know offhand if that's a crusade or not. It may be, may not, but it's against the Turks, you know, because at that point the Arabs no longer... See, that's the thing about the Arabs. They had an amazing century of jihad after Muhammad dies, and then after that they completely lost it. You know, they had their century of hurrah.
Well, their military system was simply too primitive to be successful. Right?
Well, do you think they were only successful at the time because of the quarter century of war that had happened between the Persians and Romans?
I think that was a huge part of it. Another part of it, but that doesn't explain, for example, North Africa, right? That doesn't explain Morocco. That doesn't explain Tripoli, etc. That whole part of North Africa that wasn't under the dominion of either of those two empires, but nonetheless gets swept away by the Muslim forces. You'll notice from the Arab expansion is they are at their best as an Arab expansion along places with vast deserts.
So like North Africa, North Africa, like apart from Egypt, like apart from Alexandria, like as soon as you get by Alexandria, like is there any other huge populations on the way to like there's Carthage, which is not huge but not small either.
Well, it becomes Tripoli, so it is actually a significant city at this point in time. You have a number of Algiers and a number of these cities along that coast. And it's actually very fertile. The Atlas Mountains, I believe it is, that mountain chain that in between, I think it's the Atlas Mountains and the coast, is actually a very fertile area, a narrow strip of fertility along the North African coast. But there's no real military forces there. I believe at the time that was the Vandals that were in control, and the Vandals had been smashed just earlier by the Byzantines, and then the Byzantines more or less lost control of the independent states that kind of emerge in this area. Justinian, what's the name of Justinian's great commander again?
Belisarius.
Belisarius is the one who defeats the Vandals. And so there's just not a lot of military force there, so it's easier to conquer because you don't have a lot of military strength to resist you. But they're at their best around deserted areas. And the reason for it is their way of fighting primarily was you rode to battle on a camel, and then you dismounted and fought on foot, which is a really bad way of fighting if you're not a heavy infantryman. which they weren't. They didn't have a lot of armor. So they're light spearmen, light forces that just had really good strategic mobility. And so they could appear whenever they wanted, and wherever they wanted, and they could run away before a major force of armored soldiers could get to them in the desert. And so it was very difficult for a weakened Byzantine Empire to support its vast outposts across its empire, a weakened Persian Empire to do the same. The Byzantine Empire has been hit by the bubonic plague, the Justinian plague.
Yeah.
And into this vacuum comes these raiders who are essentially doing on land what the Vikings are doing simultaneously, or just a little bit later, on sea.
Have you read this book?
I have not.
I've
heard of it. I've never read it.
This book is actually really good. It because of course we know Procopius also wrote about a large book about the conquest of Justinian and Belisarius, but in this book he talks very negatively about them. That's why it's called A Secret History. But historians, they all acknowledge he wrote it. And it talks about his wars, because wars are not cheap. And it talks about how he had to abandon all of, because he couldn't afford it anymore. He couldn't pay the soldiers on the border of the Roman Empire and Arabia. So that obviously comes into effect in the next century. Like, they don't have the plague, the war with the Persians in the first couple decades of the 7th century just weakens their military infrastructure, and it was
and they also undergo a fundamental restructuring of the military at this point in time.
Oh, do they?
So they go from the legion-based way of war to a horse archer-based way of war under Belisarius. So he changes how the Byzantines fight. But as I said before, you can't, unless you're raised in the saddle, you can't be a horse archer. Which means that they've taken since the stirrup, the invention of the stirrup, a less effective way of war in the legions, and replace it with a more effective way of war, but a way of war which citizens from Constantinople can't participate. So they're forced into becoming a mercenary army as a result of that. With its own problems. And from this point forward, you see fewer and fewer armies of Byzantines going out and fighting. It's usually people the Byzantines have paid to go out and fight for them, whether it's the Varangian Guard, horse archers, and those types of...
Yeah, they were known for using a lot of mercenaries. According to Thomas Madden, he says that they were so pretentious they thought that war was below them, which, well, that kind of got them screwed at the end because they didn't raise their own armies. They just had to pay mercenaries, and it's fine to have mercenaries, but if you run out of money and stop paying them, the mercenaries...
they turn on you.
Yeah.
The same thing happened in Rome itself. In the 1st century AD, something like 80% of the Roman army was Italian, some large percentage of the Roman army. But by the last century of its existence, the 400s, it was less than 1%. The reality is Rome fell because Romans could not be convinced to fight for it.
So who was fighting for Rome then? Spaniards?
And people from the areas outside of Italy, where you no longer had citizenship, and they were fighting in order to do their time and gain citizenship and gain a plot of land.
Huh. Okay. So we're just winding down here, Cam. Question for you: who's the greatest crusader, in your opinion? Oh, Bohemian.
Oh, sorry, greatest crusader soldier, or greatest the person who most embodies the ethos of the Crusades?
I don't know. I just wrote down here, ask who is the greatest crusader.
Because if you want the person who most embodies the ethos of the Crusades, it's Godfrey of Bouillon, in my opinion. A solid commander, a good leader, not an imaginative or great strategist, but probably he was a good man. He fundamentally wanted to do what was right. The idea of, he went on crusade because he was a knight to his core, but the idea of violence really bothered him, and so the idea of being able to do violence for God was good. And his influence has a lot to do with the reason why you see virtually no war rape during the First Crusade, and during all the Crusades afterwards. It sets the tone. War crimes as a result of the Crusades are much, much, much less than almost any other military campaign at that period of time or before. You have a huge step forward in the concept of how a just war should be waged from the Crusades, something that people often forget.
So Reynald of Chatillon is an exception then, not the norm.
Yes, so it was an imperfect system. Massacres happened during the First Crusade, right? There's no denying massacres happened. But looting and, in particular, sexual assault were very rare. And this is contrary to the way war had been waged entirely up until then, including by these same princes against other princes in Europe. And that's the foundation from which we grow our current way of thinking about war, and just war. It's from that foundation. After that, we come to the idea that you can't kill civilians in warfare, that these boundaries that we build up around just war. Before that, there was just war. It wasn't justified, though, right? It wasn't a just war. It was just war. It was violent. It was vicious. It was all things go. And when he conquered, that conquered people were absolutely subject to whatever win you had.
Well,
this time we see that pullback from that.
Well, keep in mind, you probably heard of Ibn Jubair, the Spanish Muslim who passes through the Frankish Crusader states in the 1180s on his way to Mecca, and he talks about how the Muslims there live better lives under the Crusader states than they do in the neighboring Muslim lands, which would have been Saladin's land. And I think even Saladin, he's known to be more tolerant than other Muslims. Like, his physician was a Jew, Maimonides. But still, the Crusader, and this is a Muslim testimony. You can't call it biased,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So, have you got any book recommendations on the Crusades? A lot of people are at home; they can do some reading.
Yeah, I would say go back to the original sources. So Fulcher of Chartres, Anna Communis, her book. The original sources they're not infallible, but they will give you a better sense of what's going on than a lot of the later sources. In particular, modern history likes to denigrate Crusaders and likes to make them out to be a proto-colonialists, which they weren't, or things like that. So be a little bit jaded when you read a modern history of the Crusades, because they have a political axe to grind that has nothing to do with their scholarship, and that in fact negatively impacts their scholarship. So.
What do you think about Thomas Madden?
I've heard good things. I haven't actually read that book, but I've heard good things.
I endorse this book. He's got books, like he's got a book specifically on the Fourth Crusade. We didn't get a chance to get into that one, where the Crusaders kind of go rogue and sack Constantinople. And it seems like every second person in Constantinople that time is named Alexius. They're like, oh, there's another Alexius. Don't get this confused with the other Alexius. There's too many Alexiuses. But, I fully endorse his book. This is an overview of the Crusades, so it's not about one. But he's got books on the Crusades. I've also got his book on Istanbul. I just purchased it. I actually used this in a video because I don't know if you saw my last video, Cam, but I talked about the fall of Constantinople, since we just had the anniversary of that a few days ago. My video came out on the anniversary. The tragic event. Like, not the fall of the Crusaders in 1204, but the final fall in in the 1400s. But so Cam, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, God bless.
God bless. Have a good one.